Hello, welcome to the MalariaGEN podcast, using genomic surveillance to better understand how to control and eliminate malaria. MalariaGEN.net. Hello, today I'll be speaking to Dr Kirk Rockett, recently retired as Genomics Research Manager at MalariaGEN, and Professor Michael Parker, Ethox Centre Director at the University of Oxford. We'll be talking about the founding of the MalariaGEN Consortium, an international research collaboration investigating genomics and malaria elimination. We'll be discussing how the early ethics research program established lasting principles for genomic research collaborations and data sharing. Hello, Kirk and Michael. Let's start with a quick roundtable. Could you introduce yourselves and maybe a little about your research?
Yes, hi, I'm Kirk Rockett, and until recently I was the MalariaGEN Research Manager. I've been in the group for the last 26 years, right from the very beginnings of MalariaGEN. My role was primarily running the laboratory operations for all our human DNA samples, which entailed working with all our partners, collecting all the samples, bringing them across to Oxford along with all the data that went with the samples, building and running the pipelines in the laboratory for processing the samples, processing them for the data we wanted to generate, and also storing that data and then handling the data, either sharing it back to partners or working with our teams to actually do the main analyses for the data. And of course, work with everybody in the teams to make all that happen.
Hello, my name's Mike Parker. I'm a professor of bioethics at the University of Oxford. I'm a director of a centre called the Ethox Centre there, and my interest is in the ethical issues, the practical ethical issues that arise in the day-to-day work of doctors, medical researchers and policymakers across a whole range of areas in medicine. The centre works really across from very clinical stuff, the sort of ethical issues that arise in hospitals, all the way through to very large research studies. My personal interest, it lies in two areas really. One is in the ethics of ethical issues that arise in genetics, quite generally, and also, on the other hand, ethical issues that arise in global health collaboration, so very large-scale collaborations involving partners in different countries around the world. And those two overlap in many ways. And MalariaGEN is a good example where ethics of genetics and ethics of global health come together. And I've been at the University of Oxford for about 20 years. And MalariaGEN is a big part of that.
Kirk, can you tell us about how the idea came about to use genomics to study severe malaria?
Well, the idea of using genetics goes back decades, really. People were starting to look at characteristics in people and starting to link these characteristics to genetic changes and associating these genetic changes with outcomes in disease. People identified in the 1940s and 50s that people with certain blood disorders actually got malaria less than normal people, let's say. And so the link has been there a long time. And one of the things that in malaria that we were doing, in the research I was involved in before I came to Oxford, we were looking at the immune response to malaria. We knew that some people got sicker than other people when they become infected with malaria. And that started to become linked with our immune response to the parasite. And in fact, the whole idea that an overactive immune response made people sick really originated in malaria in the late 70s. And it became associated with these proteins that we call cytokines. And there's one called tumor necrosis factor that again identified in the 1970s that became linked with malaria. People that produce more tumor necrosis factor when they become infected with malaria have a worse outcome. They become sicker. And the next step really was to say, well, is there an underlying genetic mechanism for that? Do genetics of some people mean that they will make more of this protein than others, and therefore if they have that genetic change they will make more TNF and they will get sick? So that really needed to be measured, and it was starting to be done in other fields, but it was very early days in malaria for these sorts of genetics to be done. And really, I think it's fair to say that Dominic Kwiatkowski's group in Oxford in the late 80s, early 90s was one of the first groups to start taking on the idea that measuring genetic changes in this tumour necrosis factor gene might help us understand what's going on in the disease processes in malaria. And so about the time I joined the group in 1995, the first genetic study that Dominic was involved in was being done, looking at one or two polymorphisms, as they're known. These are the changes in the DNA, looking at one or two of those in a small study set and identifying a link between a change in the DNA with severe disease started to happen. From there, as sort of positive results started coming out, more and more was done. We wanted to do bigger studies. We wanted to get studies from more places, and we wanted to also try and look for new changes in not only the tumour necrosis factor gene, but perhaps in other genes. And so it was just sort of building upon those early sorts of studies that we were doing.
Michael, if I can come to you for a moment, during this period, so genetics being used in this way for public health, infectious disease, what was happening with ethics and genetics and genomics at this time?
It's really interesting to reflect on that. Where were the ethicists at the point when scientists were starting to think about genomics in this kind of way? I think inevitably as non-scientists we were unaware of many of these changes, I suppose, but there was a lot of work being done in three relevant areas. So one was a lot of thinking had been done about the implications of genetics, the use of genetics in clinical care, but also in research. So the majority at that time, I suppose, in the research context was going to be focused on research around single gene disorders, disorders that get inherited in families in a kind of, in a simpler, more obvious kind of way: Huntington's disease, breast cancer, cystic fibrosis, those kind of questions, sickle cell. And so thinking about what are the ethical issues of testing one person for these kind of disorder, and then, for example, how you go about informing family members about that, how you go about dealing with uncertainty and risk, how do you explain at the point of offering a person a test what that means in terms of the likelihood of a positive result and the implications of a positive result for them and their family members. And lots of the ethical issues at that time were about those kind of issues, but also around this increasing sense that medicine was becoming geneticized, and that might lead to a sort of sense of genetic determinism, that people think their genes cause kind of whatever's going to happen in their life, as it were. So one area of concern for ethicists was around the ethics of clinical genetics. Another area that's relevant but wasn't specifically about genetics was the ethics of doing research in lower middle income countries. So the idea of what are the ethical issues involved in doing research, HIV research, for example, in Africa. And there were lots of debates about the differences of standards of care, for example, in that research. So, is it appropriate to do a study in Africa that wouldn't be allowed in America or Europe or the UK? And under what kind of circumstances might that be allowed? And then there's a sort of third area, really, which is just research ethics in general. So, on the one hand, you've got an interest in the people in the future. We do research in order to benefit people in the future who might get sick or might be prevented from getting sick. But often doing that requires you to subject people in the present, involve them in a trial which might, for example, subject them to some level of risk. So what level of risk is it, and what level of risk and uncertainty is acceptable to subject someone in the present to in the interest of all these people in the future? So you've got these sort of three areas in ethics: genetics, research ethics, and research in low and middle income countries. And I think one of the interesting things about MalariaGEN is the way it brought all those three things together in one place.
We've heard the context of both the starting with genetics to answer questions and the parallel development of ethics. When did these two come together for MalariaGEN? Was it before its formation, or was it more of a symbiotic relationship that got the ethics program running?
So just a few bits of context, really. I think from a scientist's perspective, what you want to do is be able to do your research in as open, as full way as possible, because we're trying to understand what's happening we're trying to understand these processes, biological processes. And for that, you really want to work on everything and anything as deep and as open as possible. However, I think that's where it's not a conflict, but that's where you do have to take into consideration that the implications of what your scientific research is doing. As Mike says, working in diverse groups in Africa, you've got to take account of their income status, perhaps. What are the implications for them? What are the implications for identifying something in an ethnic group, a minor ethnic group? Could that lead to some stigmatization of the group? So we were trying to do the science. I mean, the nice thing was, even then, all the research groups that were involved in this, you had to put your ideas to a committee, a local committee, at least at the institution, that will review that and decide whether not only was it scientifically worthy, perhaps, but also whether there were perhaps some implications for their own populations and other matters. We were working in that area and thinking about these things, and I think it became, as you say, a sort of a natural symbiosis, that we knew that in order to take on bigger research projects involving genetics, and with the sort of atmosphere that was going on around the world and ethics coming in and becoming more and more important, it was key that we just got involved in it. We wanted to as well. We wanted to do the right thing. And as Mike says, with the genetics, if we identified a change in the genetics that directly led to severe illness, let's say, or even better, something that actually protected people, how would that information be used? So it was very important that we engaged with Ethox and the ethicists to discuss all these matters, to come to a way that we could work together to do our scientific experiments in the right way, I suppose.
So Michael, in that coming together that Kirk's just mentioned, how did that coming together occur, and what approach was agreed of bringing ethics into the not quite yet formed MalariaGEN consortium?
I can really still very clearly remember the day I got a call from Dominic. So we'd been on the same campus, I don't know, for a few years anyway, but never really spoken to each other. I got this call from him saying that he was planning with some scientists in different countries to put together a proposal to go to the Gates Foundation as part of their Grand Challenges scheme to establish this network. I was surprised that he called me, because, as I say, ethics was off in all these different directions, really, and looking at different things, and my main interest had been clinical genetics, really. But I was really pleased when he did call. I was impressed by, firstly, his clear interest and concern about the ethical aspects of this and getting those right, and clearly had thought a lot about this for a long time. And the fact that I'd been contacted in advance of the application, so kind of early stages of putting together the proposal, was quite unusual. So what usually happens in ethics is that, even now, but less so, is sort of halfway through a project, the scientist comes across some ethical problem and says, oh, we need someone to fix this, which is okay too, but actually this is much nicer to be called in earlier on and to think about these things and to think about what would be required for this project to be successful, recognizing that addressing ethical roadblocks is part of being successful, and so having that built in. And I was really pleased to have been asked that question early. And also, as I got to meet the other scientists, it was clear there was a general interest in this. So the first thing that happened to me was I got this phone call and agreed, and then we talked about what would be needed to make this happen. And the scale of this project was clearly one which, was going to need a significant amount of work from the ethics perspective as well as the science perspective. We agreed that, firstly, that we would need to do work at the consortium level. So with the consortium meetings, which would happen on a fairly regular basis, would be ones where there would be an ethics strand to those meetings. The other was that we decided that we would employ an in-house ethics person, so someone with experience of thinking about ethics in a practical way, but also thinking about policy and thinking internationally. And so we advertised for a position and got some really great candidates. In the end, we decided to appoint 2 people rather than 1, because we got such great people. Susan Bull and Jantina de Vries were the people we appointed. But as I say, it was clear from the beginning that ethics was going to be treated as a kind of equivalent, to the other aspects of the consortium. This was a set of problems that needed to be addressed. And the other thing, I suppose, just finally worth noting, is that there were different views about what ethics was and what the ethical problems that were interesting were. And so that was one of the issues as well. How do you start a conversation about that when you've got people in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, different parts of Africa, and in Europe? And how do you start that conversation? I think is a really, really interesting one.
So Kirk, if I can get you to cast your mind back to that moment, those different priorities in ethics, do you remember conversations around those or how those developed and actually bringing together a program that was agreed broadly across a range of different contributors from different countries?
Well, yes, I think, as Mike says, one of the things we wanted to do was to work across many countries. We're already working sort of in the early 2000s with maybe 4 or 5 different countries. So we had an idea of the process that each site went through in order to start a research program to collect DNA samples, for example. But it was quite clear that there were differences between those, and we were wanting perhaps to work with other countries, researchers in other countries, where perhaps their way of doing the research was very different to everybody else. It was important to perhaps think about how do we look at what people are doing? Can we provide help to people to, as Mike says, to start those conversations about ethics? How do we help people understand what we're trying to do? Because, as Mike says, we all have different views. Our society's view on ethics is very different to some of the African countries. They're philosophical and religious and all sorts of different things, reasons why we have different views on these things. And in order to work together, we have to understand each other. And it's another big ethical question. How do we, in our society, say to somebody else, oh, we don't agree with your ethics? Can't just disagree with them. We need to discuss and understand what's going on. And in order to do that and to do the research we wanted, that's what we needed to do. And as Mike says, we needed to put together this program where we could do a research project on what's going on in the countries, to help bring them together, understand what's going on, and understand what's going on for our own work in malaria, not just us in the UK, but the research in that country as well, to help bring that research to fruition. Because it wasn't just about collecting the samples and finding a result. There were other things there as well. We wanted to do things with the data, share the data with other people, not only the researchers with their own consortium, but more widely. And so how did a country think about sharing the genetic data on their population with the rest of the world, for example? So we needed to understand what they thought about that. And then across all the countries, look at what some of the commonalities were to see whether there was any common ground that will allow us do some of these research things, share the research data with people. One of the things that's becoming more and more prominent with science now is the sharing of data. I mean, on one hand, it's a wonderful thing because it allows other people to look at the data in different ways to the way you've done it and perhaps discover new things for the good of the science. But we have to then be careful that it's not used in the wrong way. And so it's a bit of a Pandora's box. And so we have to work with the countries so everybody can understand this Pandora's box and, how are we going to open it a little bit or fully, and to make sure everybody's on board with that.
So Michael, how did you go about creating a program that resulted in clearly a significant level of trust in the output of that program?
One of the things that I think was striking from the start of the MalariaGEN initiative was that although it was clearly led by Dominik Kwiatkowski, it was a very, it was a group of scientists, a large group of scientists, where everyone felt completely free to speak their mind. It wasn't like all of the leadership came from Oxford, although clearly, the program had been put together by that group. So, there were differences of opinion. As inevitably, people had different views about what counted in ethics. People had everyone across the consortium had to struggle to make sense of what people from other parts of the world meant when they said, that something was right or was wrong. So everyone was in the same boat in a way. I mean, Dominic and the Oxford group had to sort of facilitate that, but essentially so it was a struggle for everyone, really. And one of the things that strikes me about this was actually, over time, because these ethical problems were things that everyone was worried about in different ways from different perspectives, the conversation about ethics actually in some ways played an important role in building the consortium, making it a real kind of living thing, because people had to have these conversations about consent. What's the approach to consent that is the right one? How do we think about data? How do we think about sharing data, both externally to the wider world ultimately, but also within the group? How do you manage that? So I actually think the conversation about ethics was quite instrumental. It'd be interesting to know Kirk's perspective, but it felt like the ethics conversation was actually quite a good way of building the consortium and building those relationships across the large group. And it felt fairly natural, actually. Your question was about the extent to which how we got those conversations going, but actually there was a recognition that these problems needed to be talked about, and I found it easy in a way to get these conversations going. I remember the very first meeting I went to, which was before MalariaGEN started, but as part of the process. It was in Ghana, in Accra, and we just said, well, how are we going to deal with this? And everyone chipped in, and it was easy to get it going. Obviously that doesn't mean it was easy to reach agreement or anything like that, because there were challenges, obviously. But everyone was keen to get involved, and it was a very free-flowing kind of consortium in that sense, I thought.
Well, I think Mike just said it at the end there. I think the willingness of everybody just to get involved. I mean, I think it's important to say that in trying to set this up, Mike used the word facilitating, and I think that was right. The way we wanted to go about this was to build a consortium. It wasn't about this kind of them or us. The consortium relied on everybody working together. We all relied on each other, and it wouldn't work without everybody. And that was important. The best thing for me, I think, was that consortial nature of it all. Everybody working together, everybody wanting to do this, and just saying, well, how are we going to do it? And as Mike says, everybody was willing to have these conversations and talk about it, and it was difficult. I mean, we had lots of conversations. How do we define the clinical side of it for collecting phenotypes from people? How do we look at the ethics? How do we do data sharing? How are we going to do all this? I mean, they were long and drawn out sometimes, and in some cases there were compromises. In some others, we just had to say, well, we can't do that, because it was a consortium and we weren't just trying to push our own way through this. We wanted to do the right thing all round and work with everybody. And as such, I think that was one of the strengths of the consortium, that everybody was working together for this common goal of trying to ask the question about what are the underlying genetic mechanisms involved in protection from malaria, and also trying to understand the disease process in malaria. And in order to do that, we had to deal with all these other things and to make them right, so that we could take the science forward.
Sorry, can I add something to it?
Yeah.
If you were going to ask me what was the most interesting and new ethical problem that arose in this, I mean, there were lots of ethical issues, and many of them you could kind of imagine what they were. But I think one of the things that struck me at the beginning in the very first early meetings was that, so you've got a large number of scientists around the world, all of whom, particularly the more senior ones, had built their careers based on a kind of research that preceded large-scale genomics. So they'd built their careers on having particularly communities they worked with, or at a certain scale. So they'd previously worked with small numbers of samples in a very in-depth way. And the cutting edge, it was clear at the point that MalariaGEN was founded that the cutting edge of science was moving away from that to a much more large scale. If you wanted to be at the cutting edge of malaria research, you really had to be working as part of these big groups. But that presents a real risk for people. So people have got their careers built on having control, in a way, of sometimes a location and sometimes a particular way of doing things. And they have to give that up and take a risk to step into this big consortium if they really want to be at the cutting edge of science. And there was a lot for them, I think, potentially to lose, and also a lot to gain. So they really had to have confidence, both in the leadership of the MalariaGEN initiative, but also that they would be treated with respect and that they would remain at the cutting edge of science. They wouldn't just be seen as sample collectors for a larger initiative. that trust and how you build it and how you treat people with respect was actually, I think, the most interesting and challenging ethical kind of problem, really.
Yes, and for me, I think just learning this stuff, because as a scientist, the ethics was sort of something a bit in the background, but actually working with Mike, Jantina and Susie, having discussions, certainly with Susie and Jantina, I was trying to explain what we were trying to do at the science level, and then they were explaining to me how that fits in with the ethics and the ethics side of things. And so we would have these long discussions about that, which I think was really important to understand how these two sides come together and the implications on what we were all doing, because somewhere in there we had to find a way to explain this to everybody else in order to do the science that we wanted to do. And I found that really interesting. Yes, it was challenging, but really interesting. And I think as a scientist myself, I've really benefited from this interaction with the ethics teams and learning. I've learned an awful lot about ethics, and I think our partners have too.
Was there a particular approach that was taken? Were you looking to get consensus, or were there vetoes, or just a little bit of the nitty-gritty of getting to a final decision so that you had statements on each of these areas and how the consortium worked together? How did that work?
The practical realities of this are quite hard, inevitably on the ground. So some of these things are quite formal in the sense that the project needs to get ethics approval in each of the locations where it does its work. So each of those ethics committees will be working according to a different regulatory structure. They'll have different people on them and they'll have different concerns. So there'll be some people who their biggest concern is not genetics, but blood samples leaving the country, for example. In other places, the genetics will be a worry. In other places, things like benefits and how are the population going to be treated with respect. Those are going to be important. So some of it's quite formal. It's about dealing with issues in a way that helps the people on those ethics committees to feel confident. Some of it is quite pragmatic and practical, so the stuff about achieving agreement across the consortium about how the data will be managed and how scientific questions will be identified and who will be involved in that process. The ethics committee doesn't have a view about that so much. I mean, they'll want to know there's a process in place, but the practicalities of it will be about, in a way, a kind of political process, of sort of reaching agreement across difference. A good example is the data sharing policy, the internal and external data sharing policies. And the way we did that really was sort of, doing a bit of sounding out, asking people what their concerns were, put together a draft discussion paper, which was circulated for comments. And then we had a big consortium meeting where everyone was brought together. There was an in-depth discussion about it. A document was revised in the light of that discussion, circulated around for agreement. It wasn't easy, but relatively quickly we came to a view or the consortium came to a view that the policy was one they were happy with. In some cases, it's very formal. In some cases, it's about negotiation. And then, of course, there's the stuff that's really on the ground, which is field workers going out to collect blood samples. Particularly, let's say you're collecting blood samples for people who are going to be controls. You're going to get a sample from a child that's not sick. How do you explain to that mother you need a blood sample because the child's not sick in order to study a project which is about malaria? How do you do that in rural, West Africa or Papua New Guinea or wherever it happens to be? It's a really interesting set of problems, and all those things have to be worked out in different ways.
Yes, and also from once the data is established, for example, in principle, if countries would allow their data to be released, it was under what terms? What would they allow to be released? We're not talking about everything. We were quite limited in the information we could release, and that was fair enough. But we also had to modify what we do as time went on. We couldn't just be fixed and say, well, you said it at that point in time. We have to change as the times change. And so for certain sites, if the ethics situation in a country changed, it meant that we maybe not be able to release that data anymore. So we have to keep watching those things and keep an eye on those things. And we were releasing the data for certain research purposes only. And so some countries may be more open to what their data could be used for than others. From an underlying common release of certain aspects of data from all places, then there might be extra layers on top of that, where if a researcher wanting to use the data wanted to use it for a certain purpose, it might be that they would have to actually go back to the ethics committee in question in the country of origin, of data origin, to ask them, well, can we do this research? But we want it to almost led from the country of origin for the data about their people, if you like, and if they're not comfortable with that data being used for a purpose, then maybe we don't release it.
I'm just wondering how it began to shape ethics in this sort of genomic area.
I think MalariaGEN really was the first large-scale international project, certainly the largest project involving low middle income countries around the world at scale, which took ethics really seriously. And actually in many ways it took it more seriously than even very high profiles like the Human Genome Project, for example. So the Human Genome Project had an ELSI program. But I think the thing about MalariaGEN, which was really interesting, was the way that ethics was actually properly built into the project, embedded in a way that really was taken very seriously. So I was a PI on the project along with the scientific PIs, went to the management meetings, and all that was, I think indicative of the seriousness with which Dominic and all the other partners took ethics. So I think it was new. And I think that it's become more common as a result. I mean, I think MalariaGEN was very influential in that way. I think it was, certainly it's been hugely beneficial in my career. I think I learned a lot from Dominic and from the group, particularly from the African partners, I think, about what it means to develop and coordinate a network internationally in a way that's fair and respectful, and that involves genuinely kind of taking account of the interests of people in institutions that perhaps don't have as many resources, and how you do that, and the problems of how you do that in a way that is effective and serious, and at the same time is conducive to the success of the overall thing. That's a challenge. It's not easy. It requires a lot of work and a lot of focus. I think that's one thing I learned from that. I think one other way in which MalariaGEN has been very influential on the ethics of science is in this question about how you manage data release and data access. I think MalariaGEN happened at a time when a lot of the emphasis in genomics was in very rapid release of sequences. So the Human Genome Project, you've got to release your sequences within 24 hours, basically. And a very strong sense that immediate open access was the way to go. And MalariaGEN was really set up with that in mind. But it became apparent very quickly that the partners weren't completely happy with that because of some of the issues that we've discussed earlier, to do with some careful thought needs to be put into this because of the potential implications for populations, but also if you release data very quickly, then possibly other scientists get to work on it in a quick way, which undermines the local emerging capacity. And I think what emerged from those conversations was an approach to data release, which has come to be known as managed data release. So this is the idea that you do release data very quickly, you're very open with it, but you do it through a process of having an access review committee. People have to make proposals. They get dealt with very quickly, but consideration is given to local sensitivities, to the sustainability of the science. MalariaGEN's model was taken up by the Wellcome Trust Case Control Consortium, and it was taken up by many other large initiatives afterwards. And I think MalariaGEN needs to take some credit for that, actually, because it has been very influential as a model.
I think Mike summed it up very well. I think really the only things to add is that we couldn't have done the science without handling all the ethics, because it's one thing to generate the data, but if you can't do anything with it because people turn around and say you can't do that or you've done that wrong, then it is about sustainability and credibility as well as everything else. Or one thing that I think we've certainly learned about this is that you put the ethics in place early on, have those discussions when you're planning your research program, build in the ethics at the time, have the discussions early on, because that will help you decide on what you can and can't do at the science level. And also, it's probably easier to do it beforehand. I mean, it's not easy anyway. It's a tough thing to do, and you have lots of conversations and discussions. But do it early on, rather than trying to fit it in later. Once you've generated the data and you're ready to publish your paper, the last thing you want are all the ethics committees saying you can't do that. But having said that, I think you then have to keep following up throughout. You can't just put it aside and say, tick, done. It's a moving field. You have to keep with it. So one example, actually, Over the time in MalariaGEN, we started out with a scientific goal based on what was available at the time. At the time, with the funds we had available and the technology we had available, we knew that we could undertake a genome-wide scan in the Gambia. That was our primary goal right at the very beginning, one of our main objectives in our Gates grant. But as we started doing this, so the technology changed and allowed us to do more. So we had to go back to the various countries that we wanted to do this extra work in and discuss with the ethics committees and put amendments in and proposals in to do this new work in those new countries with new technologies. So we had to amend things, we had to discuss with them, we had to ask those countries about the data release because we were going to generate extra data. And we couldn't have done that without a continuous discussion and update and dialogue. And I think that's what's very important here.
Can I maybe say one sort of final thing, really? I think it's really important to acknowledge the work that Susie Yantina did in this. So they were really the people doing this in a very sort of hands-on way. Yantina dealt with all of the work around the kind of getting the ethics approvals that were needed and negotiating amendments to ethics approval, building relationships with partners. And Susie did a huge amount of work around the data access, data policies and so on. But without them, I think, really this wouldn't have been successful in the same kind of way. But the other thing is that it also hugely benefited them as people. So Yantina now is a professor at the University of Cape Town and runs her own Ethics Centre. And Susie is a professor in the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And those are two examples of the ways in which MalariaGEN also benefited the ethics field as well as learning from it. And it also did that across the other countries, the countries where the research was being done. Brilliant example is Paulina Tindana, who is Ghanaian and did her PhD as part of MalariaGEN on the export of blood samples from East and West Africa, Kenya and Ghana, and then has gone on to build a successful career at the University of Ghana. She's one example of the many people in this network who've benefited, ethicists who've benefited from being part of this. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that the ethics is, it's all been kind of us giving to MalariaGEN. We've benefited hugely from this. And if Paulina were here, she would, I'm sure, kind of express her gratitude to the support she's received.
Yes, and I'd like to say my thanks to all of those individuals as well, because without them, this would never have really happened. And also, because of what they've done, it's meant that we've continued with an ethics component in MalariaGEN. We still have people employed to look after the ethics because it's important. I think if we didn't have that now, if we said, oh, it's all done, we don't need any ethics team anymore, it would be a bit of a disaster, really. And I think a lot more research groups would benefit by having contact with ethics teams. Working together is one of the things that I've really enjoyed about MalariaGEN.
We've heard a little bit from Michael about how his career has changed, but Kirk, how has your career changed due to the consortium, and how have those that you worked with within the consortium, how have their careers changed because of MalariaGEN?
Well, I've had a wonderful time. We've had to develop the laboratory side from what was a very small research group, right, to building large-scale pipelines in the laboratory and changing the way we work in the lab from a small research group to really more of a business-like operation for handling samples. But alongside that, working with people, working with our partners and getting to know them, they really are. I think that's been the most wonderful thing for me, is just working with this big diverse group of people, to be able to call them friends and get to know them more. Because as part of what we did, we had a lot of visitors come into the lab from the various countries. They came over not only to do research projects for their own education, for degrees or PhDs even, but also for training purposes. One of the things MalariaGEN did was, in establishing these links with our partners, we needed a way to communicate with the partner on a day-to-day basis. And I think, as many scientists will know, having the PIs in the group as the points of contact doesn't really work. You need people on the ground, so to speak. So we set up a program called MalariaGEN Data Fellows, where each site identified somebody in their laboratory to act as our point of contact. And so some of those people in the beginning Lucas in Ghana is one, Deus in Tanzania another one. These individuals, they may have been at the beginning of their careers, and through this program they've gone on to do PhDs, and they're now PIs in their own right in their own countries, leading their own research projects now. And I think that's been really, really good to see how, like Yantina and Susie and Paulina have developed their careers in ethics, how some of the scientists have developed their careers with us and have gone on to now become recognised people in their own right in their own countries, and in fact evolved in their own malaria networks looking at parasite genetics, and still thankfully working with MalariaGEN as well. That's good to see. I think that's what you want to do as a scientist when you're running a group and you're training people. You want to see people flourish. You want to see people do well and go on to have successful careers.
I mean, one thing just to add, one of the things that being part of MalariaGEN did for me personally, or maybe this is two things. One was just raise my awareness of the kind of ethical issues that arise in this kind of work. So, I had some sense before, but really get a sense in-depth understanding of what it means to do research on genetics in a number of different countries. That I really learned a lot about that. But also raised in me an awareness of the fact that there were lots of people in many countries who had a strong interest in ethics and were interested in careers in ethics closely associated with science. And that gave me the idea of going to the Wellcome Trust and asking for some money to create a large international ethics network. It's called the Global Health Bioethics Network. And Wellcome at the time were kind of a little bit skeptical because most ethics projects are small. And so what I was proposing was a project which was going to be working with partners in several African countries and Southeast Asian countries, and do research on ethical issues arising in projects like MalariaGEN, but also build capacity, so training opportunities, as it were. And the fact that I'd been involved in MalariaGEN for a few years meant that I was able to go to an interview at the Wellcome Trust with the governors and be convincing when I said, look, I can do this and we can do this with partners. I did the interview with partners from Kenya and from Thailand. I think we could only have made that case with any credibility if we'd had the experience of working in MalariaGEN, and obviously that was made possible by the support from Dominic and Kirk and the team. And so, I'm very grateful for that. But I think, MalariaGEN has made a lot of things possible for many people, beyond the scientists, and that's benefited everyone. I mean, the ultimate aim here is, as we both know, the big ethical question here is how can we develop ways of intervening to improve the health of people around the world, malaria endemic countries. And part of that is scientific, and part of it is about raising kind of ethical standards too. And we've been able to do that, I think, largely because of the support of the scientists in MalariaGEN.
Thank you so much, Michael and Kirk, for spending the time with me and sharing your early experiences of the MalariaGEN Consortium. I can hear you have so much more to share, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I hope we can get you around the microphone in the future.
I'm sure Mike would say as well, we could probably talk about this all day, but maybe that's for another time.
As Kirk says, give us a beer. We could talk about this for a week. All right, good to see you.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Brought to you by MalariaGEN.net.